My daughter's husband stood at my kitchen table last spring, spreading out papers from his attorney like he was closing a real estate deal, and told me that a man my age shouldn't be managing property alone. I'm Raymond Cole, 64 years old. I drive a 2001 Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror and a dent in the rear panel I never bothered fixing. I wear Wranglers and work boots most days, drink coffee from a gas station thermos, and keep my lawn mowed with a push mower I bought used in 2009. My son-in-law looked at all of that and saw exactly what he wanted to see. A simple old man who didn't fully understand how the world worked anymore. What Brandon Holt didn't know was that I owned Cole Supply Group, 23 wholesale electrical and plumbing supply locations across 8 states, along with 14 commercial properties in 4 of those states, with a combined valuation of approximately $58 million. When he slid those papers across my kitchen table and told me to sign, I folded my hands over them instead, smiled, and said I'd think about it. That night, I made 2 phone calls. The education that followed cost my son-in-law considerably more than he ever intended to spend. Most people who meet me never ask a second question. What they see is what they expect. A retired electrician from Beaumont, Texas, who spent 30 years doing residential and commercial wiring work. I've got the hands for it, thick and scarred in the right places, and I still talk like someone who's climbed more attic ladders than conference room staircases. My truck has a parking sticker from the local hardware store still stuck to the back window from 2014. I bring grocery store pound cake to family gatherings and decline offers of fancy wine because I tell people I can't tell the difference and I'd rather not pretend otherwise. That part's actually true. I genuinely cannot tell the difference, and I have never once felt bad about it. Claire is my only daughter. 30 years old, sharp as a tack, works in marketing for a medical device company in Houston. She got her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which is mostly a good thing and occasionally a problem. Patricia died 8 years ago, ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. That is the kind of thing that recalibrates everything. Afterward, I sold my electrical contracting company, the one I'd spent 15 years building from a 2-man crew into a regional operation with 47 employees, and I put the proceeds into what eventually became Cole Supply Group. Patricia had always told me I was better at building structures than running them. She wasn't wrong about much. I didn't tell Claire about the business. That's the question everyone eventually asks, and I want to address it honestly. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a test I set up in advance waiting for someone to fail. After Patricia died, I didn't talk about money to anyone for a long time because the only person I'd ever talked through every financial decision with was gone. I just kept working. I kept living the way we'd always lived practically, without performance. Claire was in college when I sold the contracting business. She knew I was comfortable. She assumed I meant modest, comfortable. And I never corrected that assumption because it didn't seem to matter, and because a part of me liked being just her dad, the man who fixed her apartment's faulty outlets when she moved to Houston and brought her soup when she had a cold, not a net worth. She met Brandon Holt at a corporate happy hour in the spring of 3 years ago. I liked him fine at first. Good-looking kid, confident handshake, asked me questions about electrical work like he was genuinely curious. Financial advisor at Meridian Capital Partners, making somewhere around $180,000 a year plus bonuses. His parents, Gerald and Diane, own 4 car dealerships in the Houston area and sit on the kind of charity boards where attendance doubles as a social credential. The Holt family is the type that keeps track of where everyone stands, without ever saying so directly. The first sign that something was shifting came about 8 months after the wedding. Brandon and Claire came to visit, and I noticed him walking the property more carefully than a son-in-law needs to. The house is a 3-bedroom Craftsman I bought in 2003 with cash, on about 2 acres outside Beaumont. Nothing spectacular, but well-built and paid for. I watched Brandon measure the distance between the workshop and the property line with his eyes the way contractors do when they're pricing a job. He mentioned twice, casually, that the area was developing fast. By Christmas, Claire had started referring to it as the family property in conversations with Diane Holt. Not once, several times. At dinner on Christmas Eve, Diane asked me if I'd given any thought to what would happen to the house long term. She said it kindly, The way wealthy people sometimes say things that are actually suggestions dressed up as concern. The house would be wonderful for a young family, she mentioned. So much potential with the right renovation. I told her I liked it fine the way it was. The second sign was when Brandon started bringing up cognitive decline the way people do when they're building a case slowly, placing the idea gently so it doesn't look like what it is. He sent me an article about estate planning for retired tradespeople. He mentioned, more than once, a neighbor of his parents who had waited too long to sort out his affairs and left his family in a complicated situation. He asked me once if I'd spoken to a financial planner recently, and when I said I hadn't needed one, he looked at Claire with an expression I was not supposed to notice. The letter arrived in February. Official letterhead from Stanton and Graves, a Houston firm. I'd later learned that Diane Holt's brother was a partner there. The letter was polite, measured, and thorough in the way legal pressure is when it's been carefully constructed. It outlined concerns about property maintenance, estate planning gaps, and what it called the financial vulnerability of single elderly homeowners in appreciating markets. It suggested, strongly, that a family trust arrangement, one that transferred primary ownership of the property to Claire and Brandon while guaranteeing me right of residence for up to 3 years, would be the most prudent course of action for everyone involved. It noted that the property had been recently assessed at $680,000. It said the family wanted to help me protect my legacy. My legacy. In the house I'd paid cash for. The house where I still had Patricia's rose garden along the south fence. I called Claire. She answered, sounding slightly rehearsed. Dad, we just want you to be taken care of. You're not getting any younger, and Brandon's been worried about you managing everything alone. We talked to an estate attorney, and this is just the smart thing to do. I asked her if this was her idea or Brandon's. She paused one beat too long before saying it was both of theirs. I told her I'd think about it. When I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, Patricia's table, the one we bought at an estate sale in 2001, and I understood something clearly. My son-in-law had looked at my truck and my work boots and my gas station coffee and calculated that I didn't have the resources or the legal knowledge to push back. He had miscalculated. I called Marcus Webb the next morning. Marcus has been my attorney for 22 years, since before I sold the contracting business, since before Cole Supply Group existed in anything but a plan in a notebook. He picked up before the second ring. Ray, it's early. What happened? I told him about the letter. He was quiet while he read the copy I photographed and sent him. Then he made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. You want to respond or you want to respond? He asked. I told him I wanted the second one. Give me 48 hours, he said. While Marcus worked, I called Danny Chen, the COO who runs daily operations at Cole Supply Group from our main office in Dallas. Danny's been with me for 14 years. He knows the business better than anyone alive, and he is the reason I can live in Beaumont driving a dented truck without the world collapsing. I told him what was happening. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about him. Then he asked, quietly, if I needed him to do anything about the Meridian account. I told him I'd let him know. Meridian Capital Partners, the firm where Brandon worked, handled the investment allocation for 3 of Cole Supply Group's pension-adjacent accounts. It wasn't a large piece of their book, but it wasn't invisible either. I told Danny to pull the account records and have them ready. Not yet, I said, but ready. Marcus called back in 36 hours. He had prepared a counter-document that transferred the property not to Brandon and Claire, but to the Raymond and Patricia Cole Family Trust, with me as sole trustee, and a very specific set of conditions governing any future transfer. He had also, with quiet efficiency, documented the timeline of Brandon's communications, the letter from Stanton and Graves, and what he called a pattern of coordinated pressure on an older family member regarding property rights. He used the phrase elder financial coercion. He said it was worth knowing that such patterns had legal names in Texas. I signed the trust documents on a Thursday afternoon. Then I waited. The dinner party was Brandon's idea. His firm was hosting a client appreciation event at a restaurant in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood, the kind of place with a prix menu and a sommelier who can describe wine the way I can describe wire gauges. Brandon invited me, which surprised me until Claire mentioned quietly that Gerald and Diane would be there, along with several of Brandon's clients and his firm's managing director, a man named Lawrence Pritchard, who Brandon spoke about the way some people talk about a coach they're still trying to impress. I drove my truck. I wore clean Wranglers, a button-down flannel I'd ironed myself, and the same boots I'd worn to Patricia's brother's retirement party the previous fall. I parked between a Range Rover and a Tesla and didn't feel a thing about it. Brandon met me near the entrance with the look he'd been perfecting for 2 years, a kind of affectionate tolerance, warm enough to be polite and tight enough to be uncomfortable. He was already scanning my outfit when he shook my hand. "Dad," he said, "you should have told me. I'd have lent you a sport coat." I told him I was comfortable. He laughed the way people laugh when they mean something else. The restaurant had that particular hush that expensive places cultivate. Gerald Holt was holding court near the bar with 2 men I didn't know, speaking loudly about interest rate projections. Diane saw me from across the room and smiled with the careful warmth of a woman who had decided to make peace with me being at events like this. Lawrence Pritchard introduced himself with the smooth confidence of a man who had done it 10,000 times. He asked me what I did. Brandon appeared at my elbow almost instantly. "Raymond's retired," he said pleasantly. "Used to do electrical work." Lawrence nodded. "Honest trade," he said. "The way people do when they mean to be kind and instead only reveal how they classify things." I told him electrical work was what it was. Lawrence moved on to someone more interesting. I found a seat at the edge of the room and spent most of the first hour watching. That's something I learned in business. The value of stillness in a room that assumes you're not paying attention. I watched Brandon perform for his clients. Smooth and quick and good at making people feel seen. He's genuinely talented at his work. I watched Diane touch Claire's arm repeatedly and whisper things that made Claire smile the way she does when she's a little nervous. I watched Gerald tell the same story about a dealership deal 3 times to 3 different people, each version slightly larger than the last. Halfway through the evening, a man crossed the room toward me with the direct walk of someone who knows exactly who they're going toward. He was around 40, in a good suit, and he put his hand out before he'd quite reached me. "Raymond Cole," he said. "I thought that was you." "I'm James Whitaker. We spoke at the Dallas Supply Chain Conference 2 years ago. I supply commercial electrical components to 4 contractors who buy from your Baton Rouge location." I shook his hand. "James, how's good to see you. How's the Baton Rouge team treating you?" James started talking about the Baton Rouge location's new account manager, and I talked back, and we fell into the kind of easy conversation that happens between people who work in the same actual world. After a few minutes, I noticed that the conversation near us had gone quiet in a particular way. I glanced over. Brandon was standing about 8 feet away, holding his wine glass, looking at me like I had just spoken in a language he hadn't known I knew. James nodded toward him. "Is this your son-in-law? I've heard him mention his father-in-law at a few events. He said you were in the trades." I said I had been. James smiled. "Cole Supply Group is a little more than the trades," he said. "No offense to the trades." He laughed. "I know 3 regional contractors who would follow your pricing structure off a cliff. What you built in the Gulf Coast market in the last decade has been genuinely impressive." I thanked him. Brandon had moved closer. James looked at him. "You didn't know, did you?" He said it lightly, like it was an interesting observation about weather. Brandon looked at me. "What is Cole Supply Group?" I reached into my shirt pocket and handed him the card I'd been carrying there all night. Danny had made them understated just the company name, my name, and the title I technically held but almost never used. Founder and chairman, Brandon read it twice. "Cole Supply Group," I said. "Wholesale electrical and plumbing distribution. 23 locations, 8 states. We do primarily commercial and industrial accounts contractors, municipalities, large residential developers. Current annual revenue is around 41 million. Our real estate holdings bring the total valuation to roughly 58 million. The table near us had gone completely silent. Lawrence Pritchard was standing 2 feet away with a look on his face like a man recalculating. "You own a $58 million company," Brandon said. His voice was entirely flat. "Patricia and I built the foundation of it," I said. "Danny Chen and his team built most of what it became. I just had the sense to stay out of their way once we got moving." Gerald Holt appeared from somewhere to my left. He had clearly heard enough of the conversation to feel the ground shifting. Raymond, he said in a voice that was carefully recalibrating its register upward. I have to say, I had no idea. I looked at him. No, I said. You didn't. You and your attorney brother sent a letter to my house, suggesting I was cognitively declining and financially vulnerable. You recommended I sign over my property and move into a guest room. The silence expanded. Lawrence Pritchard spoke carefully. There seems to be some context I'm missing. I pulled the letter from Stanton and Graves from my inner pocket, which was another thing I'd planned. I'd been carrying it since I left Beaumont that morning. I didn't pass it around. I just held it. I looked at Brandon. You calculated that I didn't have the means or the knowledge to protect what's mine. You were wrong on both counts. The property transferred to the Raymond and Patricia Cole Family Trust 12 days ago. My attorney also prepared documentation of the coordinated pressure campaign your family conducted against an older homeowner, which under Texas law carries its own particular weight. Brandon's jaw moved without producing sound. I also want you to know, I continued, that Meridian Capital Partners has managed a portion of Cole Supply Group's accounts for the past 3 years. As of Monday, those accounts transferred to Sullivan Asset Management in Dallas. That's about $2.3 million under management. I understand that represents a meaningful portion of your book, Brandon. That's not personal. That's the natural outcome of a business relationship where trust was compromised. Lawrence Pritchard put down his wine glass. He was looking at Brandon with the specific expression of a managing director who is already drafting a difficult internal conversation. Claire had gone pale. She was standing near Diane, and she looked smaller than she usually does, which is something I had never seen before and which hurt me more than anything else that evening. I want to be clear about something, I said, and I addressed this to the room generally, to the quiet table and the silent circle of clients and the Holtz and Lawrence Pritchard. I'm not angry. Anger would suggest I was surprised. I was not surprised. My son-in-law looked at an old truck and worn work boots and concluded that the man wearing them had no resources and no recourse. People make that calculation. It's a natural conclusion, when the only thing you're willing to see is the surface. What I am is tired of being managed by people who decided my worth before they asked a single question about my life. Patricia and I made a choice a long time ago to live well, which to us meant simply and honestly, not performing for anyone, not buying things to signal value we already knew we had. That choice made us comfortable in ways that had nothing to do with appearances. The fact that some people confuse that simplicity for limitation is not my problem to fix. Gerald Holt tried to speak. I put my hand up, not unkindly. I think this is a good place to stop, Gerald. I held out my hand to James Whitaker. Always good to talk business. I nodded to Lawrence Pritchard. He nodded back slowly. I found my keys, said goodnight to the room, and walked out to my truck. On the drive home, I called Danny and told him to execute the account transfer on Monday morning. He said he would. He asked how it went. I told him it went. He said he understood. I didn't sleep much that night. That's the part no one talks about in these situations. The clarity of being right doesn't make the weight any lighter. Claire was my daughter, and she was complicit in something that had aimed itself at the life Patricia and I built, and I didn't know yet what was left of us on the other side of it. Brandon's LinkedIn post went up at 11:30 that night. He'd apparently been composing it in the car on the way home, in that state people reach when their control of a narrative is slipping and they grab for public framing before it gets away entirely. He wrote about how important it was for families to have open financial conversations, how he and his wife were navigating a difficult situation with an aging parent, how the experience had taught him the value of proactive estate planning. He tagged Meridian Capital Partners. Lawrence Pritchard had it taken down by 8 the next morning. I know because Marcus sent me a screenshot of the removal notice. Claire texted me at 6 a.m. I need to talk to you, not with Brandon. Just us. Please. I texted back. I'm here. Come when you're ready. She arrived at noon. She drove her own car, not the BMW she and Brandon shared. She looked like she hadn't slept either, and she sat down at Patricia's kitchen table and put both hands flat on the surface, the way her mother used to do when she was gathering herself. We sat like that for a moment. She said, I didn't know how far Brandon had taken it. I know, I said. She said, I knew about the property conversation. I thought we were trying to help. I know how that sounds now. Tell me what it looked like from where you were standing, I said. She took a breath. She said Brandon had started the conversation about my finances about a year into their marriage. She said he'd framed it as concern that I was alone, that the property was too much for one person, that the market was rising and I should take advantage of it while I was healthy enough to enjoy the proceeds. She said it had sounded reasonable. She said she had wanted it to sound reasonable because it was easier than asking the harder question, which was why she had never actually asked me, directly, how I was doing financially, or what I wanted for myself, or what I'd spent 30 years building. I asked her why she thought I was struggling. She looked at the table. Because you live like you don't have anything extra, she said. You've always lived that way. I just assumed. I never actually asked you. And then Brandon was asking, and it seemed like the right direction, and it was easier to follow than to stop and think about what I was assuming. I told her about Patricia. She knew the outline, but not the details, how much the medical bills had been, how I'd sold the contracting business while Claire was away at school to cover them and to start fresh, how I'd put everything into Coal Supply Group, because I needed something to pour myself into, and because it was what Patricia had always said I was good at, how the business had grown faster than I had expected, how I had never known quite how to fold that information into the life I was already living with Claire, the simple life. The life where I was just her dad who drove a beat-up truck and brought grocery store pound cake. Claire cried. She didn't try to stop it. She sat at the kitchen table where Patricia used to sit and cried the way Patricia cried, quickly, fully, without hiding it. I got up and made coffee and came back and set a mug in front of her and didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Sometimes the right thing is just to let a person feel the weight of what they've understood. After a while she said, "What happens now?" I told her what I told Marcus. The trust was locked. The property was protected. The Meridian account was moving. Brandon would have a difficult conversation with Lawrence Pritchard, and that was the natural consequence of the choice he'd made. "And us," she said. "What about us?" I told her that depended on her more than it depended on me. I told her that I'd spent 30 years making certain she had everything she needed, and that part of the reason I'd never corrected her assumptions about my finances was that I hadn't wanted her to see me differently. I'd wanted to stay her father, not a figure to be managed or positioned or impressed by. I told her that what Brandon had done, the letter, the legal framing, the word cognitively, had crossed something that wasn't easily uncrossed. And I told her that if she was willing to do the harder work, the work of actually seeing people as they are, rather than as it's convenient for them to be, then there was nothing that needed to stay broken between us. She said she wanted to do that work. I told her to start by being honest with her husband. Not defensive, not managed, but honest. And then to come back and have dinner with me sometime. Real dinner. At the table. Without phones. She hugged me at the door. First real one in a long time. For 3 weeks I heard very little. Marcus sent updates. The trust documents held. The Meridian accounts transferred without incident. Brandon, according to Claire in one brief text, was under formal review at the firm regarding the LinkedIn post and related communications. She said she didn't know what that meant for his position. Then on a Saturday morning in early April, they both showed up. The BMW was gone. Claire was driving a 5-year-old Honda Accord I didn't recognize. Brandon was in the passenger seat, which was notable on its own. They came to the door together and I let them in. They sat on the same couch where Brandon had laid out those papers 3 months earlier. Neither of them had the polished surface they usually wore. Brandon looked like a man who had been put down in a field he didn't know how to cross and was only now deciding to start walking. Claire sat beside him, not touching him, not away from him either, just present, like she was committed to being in the room. Brandon spoke first. He said he'd prepared something to say, then decided not to say it the prepared way, because that was still a kind of performance, and he was trying to be done with performances for a while. He said, "I looked at you and decided I knew what I was looking at. I decided you were a limitation on Claire's future, instead of the person who made her future possible. I moved directly from that assumption to a plan without ever stopping to see whether the assumption was true." He paused. I told myself it was practical and forward-thinking. It was neither. It was contemptuous. And I'm aware that saying I'm sorry doesn't unwind what was set in motion. I told him he was right about that. I told him I appreciated the honesty. He said there was something else. He said he had gone to Lawrence Pritchard after the dinner and had told him, voluntarily, the full sequence. Not a managed version, the full sequence. That he had pressured an older family member to transfer property. That he had used the firm's professional reputation as social leverage. That the account loss was directly connected to his own conduct. He said Lawrence had told him the review was ongoing, but that the voluntary disclosure counted for something. He didn't know yet how it would end. I asked him why he'd done that. He said because Claire had told him something. She'd told him that I'd sold my contracting business and spent everything I had on Patricia's treatment without ever telling anyone, without making it anyone else's problem, without expecting anything in return. And he'd sat with that for 3 days. And realized he had married into a family where a man had quietly absorbed the hardest thing a person can absorb, and then rebuilt from scratch, and then continued to show up simply and without ceremony for 30 years, and that he had responded to that by sending a letter about cognitive decline. It was quiet in the room for a while. I told him that Patricia would have said exactly 3 words at this point, which were figure it out. She said that about most things. It drove me crazy for 30 years, and I have thought about it every week since she died. He almost smiled. He said, "What does that mean in this situation?" I said, "It means I'm not interested in staying angry. I'm interested in knowing who you're going to be next. The accounts are moved. The property is protected. Those things are done. The question in front of you is what you build from here, and that's between you and your firm and your wife, and eventually, if you want it to be, between you and me. But I'm not doing the work for you. I've done that before and it didn't help anyone." Claire said she had also taken a step. She said she'd called Gerald and Diane and told them, plainly, that their involvement in the property letters had been a mistake, and that she needed them to understand that her father was not a problem to be managed or a resource to be redirected toward her benefit. She said Diane had been quiet for a long time, and Gerald had said he understood, which was probably 60% true and 40% self-preservation. But she'd said what needed to be said. I asked her how that had felt. She said it felt like something she should have been capable of doing long before it came to this point. I got up and made coffee. Proper coffee this time, not gas station thermos. I put out the cups Patricia had bought at a market in San Antonio on a trip we'd taken when Claire was 12. The blue ones with the small painted birds. Claire looked at them for a moment. She remembered. We sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee for the better part of an hour. Brandon talked about his work, the real version of it, the parts he found genuinely interesting, and the parts that were mostly performance. Claire talked about a project at her company that was frustrating her. I told them about a supply chain complication that Danny was working through at our Nevada locations. It was an ordinary conversation between people who were deciding to start over with something closer to honesty. When they stood to leave, Brandon looked at me and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know it's not strategic." He said it was possible he was going to lose his position at Meridian, or at minimum be significantly restructured. He wasn't asking for intervention or a replacement. He was asking if there was a way to learn from me, not the money. The other thing, the part where you know what you have and you don't need anyone else to know it too. The part where you just do the work. I told him that wasn't something I could teach in a conversation. I told him he'd have to earn it by doing something difficult, without anyone watching. He'd know it had worked when he stopped waiting for someone to notice. He nodded. He said that sounded about right. Claire hugged me in the doorway and held it longer than she usually did. I told her I was having people over for dinner in 2 weeks. Nothing formal, just Danny and his wife, and a couple of people from the Beaumont location who were in town. I told her she was welcome, if she wanted to come, and to bring Brandon, if he was willing to just be a person at a dinner table, without an agenda. She said she'd be there. She said she'd even help me cook. I told her I'd hold her to that. That evening I sat on the back porch, the way I do most evenings, the same porch, where I planted Patricia's roses, the spring after she died, where I drink coffee and watch the light come down through the oaks. I picked up my phone and called Danny. He answered the way he always does, like he'd been expecting it. I told him things were settling. He asked if I needed anything adjusted. I told him I thought I might increase my visits to the regional locations this summer. I'd been desk-bound too long, and I wanted to get back into the work itself. He said the teams would like that. I said I knew. I stayed on the porch until dark. There is a particular quality to the silence out there after a long day, the dogs settling, the oak branches barely moving, the smell of the pasture coming in when the wind shifts west. Patricia called it the day letting go of itself. She had a way of naming things. I thought about what Brandon had asked me, about how you know your own worth without needing to show it. I didn't have a clean answer. It isn't a lesson that transfers easily. What I know is this. I built something over 30 years, not because I needed the world to see it, but because building it was the most honest expression of who I was. I drove the same truck because I liked the truck. I wore work boots because they were comfortable. I brought cheap coffee because it tasted fine to me. None of that was a performance of humility. It was just life, lived at the pace and scale that suited me, without needing anyone's validation to confirm that I was doing it correctly. The mistake my son-in-law made wasn't that he misjudged my bank account. It was that he looked at the surface of a life and decided he understood its interior. He saw the truck and the boots and the dented rear panel and concluded that these things meant absence of ambition, of resources, of capacity. He never considered that they might mean exactly the opposite, that a man who has nothing to prove can afford not to prove anything. Patricia used to say that the quietest people in any room are usually the ones who've earned the right to be quiet. I always thought she was talking about other people. Somewhere along the way, I think she was talking about me. If you're watching this, leave a comment and tell me where you're from. And if you're in the middle of something that looks like a setback, a letter from someone else's attorney, to a table full of people who have decided what you're worth, before you've said a word, I want you to remember one thing. The people who underestimate you are always counting the visible things. They cannot count what they cannot see. And the most important things, in my experience, have always been the ones nobody else was looking at. It took me 30 years and a $58 million company to understand that. I'm still not sure I have it all figured out, but I'm working on it. I'll keep working on it. That's the only thing that's ever gotten me anywhere worth being.